There's been a ton of discussion around the new light attack changes that ZOS is proposing for update 37. Some people are saying their damage is up, some people are worried that they are massively nerfed. So what is going on exactly with that? First off, if you are new here, welcome in. I'm Skinny Cheeks and I do a lot of guides for ESO, mostly focusing on PvE DPS, but I always love me some patch notes, and I'll be breaking down this change here to light attacks along with all of the other important changes going on. If you want the full patch note review and to see me running the brand new dungeons on the PTS, I'll have the Twitch VOD linked in the description below, but since there is quite a bit of information to cover from the update 37 patch notes, I did want to split it up into a few videos here on YouTube so that it isn't too overwhelming and I can take it one chunk at a time rather than dumping a 7-hour video in y'all's lap. But it is over there on Twitch if that's your jam. So what's going on with these light attacks? They've increased the scaling of all weapon light attacks by 50% and werewolf light attacks by 20% and introduced a stat scaling limit on these attacks so they stop benefiting from weapon or spell damage and magicka or stamina after reaching 3850 damage for weapons and 4813 for werewolf. This limit is unaffected by bonuses to damage such as critical strikes, berserk, or vulnerability. Now I know this number may look super low, but that last line is really important there. So after you take into account all of the available buffs and debuffs, plus the ability to critically strike, this is way higher than that 3850 number that your light attacks will actually end up hitting for. So I think the best way to understand that 3850 is to look at our current patch that we're in on the live servers and see what kind of stats it would take to get us to that same number. So I won't go through all of their math here, but essentially ZOS gave us the equations for the previous light attack scaling and also for the new light attack scaling. And what they've done is massively buff how much our light attacks will scale up with magicka or stamina and weapon or spell damage. So in update 37, at much lower stats, you can get to that 3850 number compared to what we are currently at. But on the other hand, what they've also done is put a cap on it. So at that point, it reaches 3850, your stats will no longer affect it. So much easier to get there, but can't go any higher. Now I've plugged in their equations into a spreadsheet and I've done all the math so that you guys don't have to. It's also highly possible that I really enjoy doing this, so definitely don't feel bad for me. Now, since the light attacks scale up with weapon or spell damage and magicka or stamina, there aren't exact set numbers for each of those to get to this 3850. Instead, it's a range of combos for those two. For example, with the previous scaling, 35k max resource and 7700 weapon or spell damage would get us exactly there. But since it is a combo of those two stats, say we had a little bit more resource at 37k, well then it would only take 7510 weapon and spell damage. Or if we only had 30k resource, it would take 8170 weapon and spell damage. Essentially, the more of one stat we have, the less of the other we need to hit that. And in our current patch in update 36, fairly high stats overall needed to hit this mark. Though it is definitely doable in organized group play and 12-person trials. But for solo or unoptimized groups, you likely are not seeing stats this high, and therefore we're probably already well under this number for your light attacks. So how does this compare to the new system? Well, with the new more aggressive scaling that they've added in that first scenario with 35k max resource, it would actually only take 4000 weapon or spell damage to hit this 3850 mark. So that means that in update 37, let's say someone has 35k magicka and 4000 spell damage, they will have their light attacks hit as hard as someone in update 36 with 35k magicka and 7700 spell damage. However, that is the cap now. You aren't getting higher than that, and even going past that 4000 spell damage mark, it's not going to matter. So to show the other two examples with varying max resources, at 30k resource, you're looking at 4477 weapon or spell damage to hit that capped amount, and only 3810 weapon and spell damage needed if you're at 37k max resource. So really what it means is that any DPS build that's even somewhat properly put together should easily be able to cap out this light attack damage. In today's game, these numbers are not difficult to achieve in your setups. So the big question everyone is wondering is, are we gaining damage to our light attacks or are we losing damage? And the answer is yes. If you are in a scenario where you are under the given stats from update 36 that get to 3850, well, then you will see a DPS increase to your light attacks. So let's say you're at 33k max magicka and 5k spell damage. With the new system, you'd be looking at around a 35% increase to your light attack damage. Pretty substantial at that range. Then at 35k max magicka and 5500 spell damage, with the new system, you'd see around a 25% increase to your light attack damage. Still really high there. Or as another example, let's say you have 37k stamina and 7000 weapon damage. You're still going to be near a 5% or so increase to your light attack damage. So obviously this is very dependent on the type of stats you normally have and the type of content that you're running in, but you can see that even with fairly high stats, this looks to still be a buff to light attacks, all the way up to that point where these stats would have added up to that 3850 base light attack damage. So let's go beyond that point. What kind of scenarios will we be losing damage to our light attacks? Well, the main one will probably be organized 12-person trials like I mentioned before. Due to the variety of buff sets we have, it's not uncommon to get beyond that 8k weapon and spell damage mark. And with Warhorn going, seeing 35 to 38k max resource is fairly common as well, though this will vary a bit depending on the gear that you're wearing. But there are definitely scenarios where our light attack damage is going to come down, but it isn't looking to be super drastic. So here in this example with 8300 spell damage and 36k magicka, we'd be looking at close to a 6% loss to our light attack damage. Now this isn't a 6% total DPS loss, don't get that part confused. Let's say our light attacks are doing 10% of our damage. Well, a 6% loss here is a 0.6% DPS loss. But let's go even further. Let's say we have really high stats and are up to 37k magicka and 9500 spell damage. Even all the way up here, it's only a 15% damage loss to our light attacks, which again, if our light attacks are 10% of our damage, that would be about a 1.5% DPS loss. But these are really high stats. So if you want to dig through this spreadsheet and plug in your own numbers to see what that's going to look like for you, I'll have it linked in the description. Just make sure to hit make a copy before you try to edit the numbers, or else you won't be able to. My big takeaway overall is that it can be quite a large bump up in light attack damage for those with lower stats, and this would include support roles like healers and tanks as well. They should see their light attack damage go up quite a bit. But even up in that high end range that you can get to, it doesn't look like it's going to be a significant loss compared to what we've already been seeing. And all these stats assume perfect uptimes and staying at those high numbers as well. So honestly, I really don't think this is going to make too much of a difference for high end gameplay. This isn't enough to significantly hurt anybody's damage, but some may feel it a tiny bit at the very high end. Now, one thing I will add is that this does slightly change up the dynamic between set bonuses. Again, not significantly, but having a lot of that max resource and weapon and spell damage not count at all towards our light attacks, some of the effective power of that stat has been lost when building our characters. So definitely something to consider when you're looking at those set bonuses now. Now, I'm not saying to ditch all of your stats besides crit and penetration. Max resources and weapon damage will still benefit all of your abilities, but having them no longer benefit your light attacks does knock them down ever so slightly, and even though crit chance and penetration were already on top, now they are just a tad bit more. And then there is another point I wanted to get into about this. ZOS said that they are confident that this functionality will help inject a little power to the players who struggle to perfectly weave by inflating their damage values a bit while not having too much of an impact on the high-end ceiling. And I think this may only be half true. This change is really more about having high stats or not about players who struggle to perfectly weave versus those who can do so effectively. So let's say we have someone that struggles to weave, but maybe they've been around a while. They have all of their golded out best in slot sets. They're running with a semi-organized trial group, so their stats are probably fine, and this isn't really going to be doing much for them. Same with practicing on the trial dummy. They're not really going to see an improvement there either. So this change doesn't necessarily help those struggling to weave perfectly unless they are also in the scenario where they have lower stats. Granted, there may be quite a bit of overlap there, and that's a fair point. I just don't know in the long run how much of a difference that this is going to make. On the heavy attack side of things, we have that massive in power change, 80% boost to heavy attacks, and Oakensoul, and those skyrocketed both the floor and the ceiling for heavy attack setups. And while it is true that the ceiling for light attack builds is a fair bit higher than for heavies, the floor is much lower. And I don't see this really making up a ton of that gap, but it is very early in the PTS still, so who knows. I'll admit, I don't have the perfect solution either. It is a tough problem to tackle, but I also worry a little bit about this whole capping out stats thing because it could be a slippery slope. We had our crit damage capped at 125% a few patches back. Now light attack damage is being capped, albeit at a fairly reasonable and high amount, but where does that stop? Will our abilities have a capped amount at some point too? I really hope not. But I don't want to get ahead of myself and way out there about something that hasn't even happened yet. Just something that was weighing on me a little with regard to the type of solution that they proposed. End of the day, with this particular change, I think more scenarios will probably see a buff here than a nerf, but there will definitely be a bit of both depending on your situation. So I hope this video helped break down the change in a way that is a little bit easier to understand. I know I've seen a lot of discourse over this already, so I thought it would be helpful to lead off with the patch note discussion on this topic. I'll also be covering all of the other changes in the patch notes as well, such as the class changes, balancing, really anything I thought looked impactful. I'm hoping to get those out each day until I've covered it all. But thank you so much for watching, and a big thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake Wayne 816, Mordecai 1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.